The pen felt heavier than it should have in my 19-year-old hands. Mom placed her manicured finger on the signature line, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through our kitchen window. "Just sign here, sweetie. It's complicated tax stuff, trust structures, and estate planning. Your father and I are just making sure everything's properly organized so you won't have any headaches later." The document was thick, full of legal language that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Something about irrevocable trust transfers and tax optimization strategies. Dad stood behind me, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder as he explained how this would protect the family assets and minimize our tax burden. I was a sophomore at State, majoring in psychology, and barely understood my own student loan paperwork, let alone complex estate documents. But these were my parents. Patricia and William Bennett had raised me, supported me, and never given me any reason to doubt their judgment. When they said this paperwork would secure my financial future, I believed them. So I signed. Natalie Bennett in my careful college girl cursive, transferring my $500,000 inheritance from Grandma Rose into something called the Bennett Family Preservation Trust. That was 10 years ago, a decade of assuming I was financially secure, that someday I'd have access to Grandma's nest egg that would help me buy a house, maybe start a business, secure my future. A decade of my parents casually mentioning how well managed the trust was performing, how grateful I'd be someday for their foresight. I had no idea I'd signed away $500,000 to fund my parents' lifestyle while I scraped by on a teacher's salary, splitting rent on a cramped apartment and driving a 15-year-old Honda with a temperamental transmission. The truth came out the way most lies do, accidentally, through a completely unrelated event that pulled on the wrong thread and unraveled everything. It started with a letter from the IRS, not to me, but to my parents, though it was mistakenly delivered to my apartment because we shared the same last name and similar addresses. I almost forwarded it unopened, but something about the official seal and the words Criminal Investigation Division made me hesitate. I told myself I was just checking to make sure it wasn't something urgent. Identity theft was common, and maybe they needed to know right away. So I opened it. What I found inside changed everything. The letter was notification that William and Patricia Bennett were under investigation for potential tax fraud, wire fraud, and violations of fiduciary duty in connection with the misappropriation of trust assets. It referenced account numbers, transfer dates, and dollar amounts that made my stomach drop. One line stood out like a neon sign. Investigation pertains to the improper transfer of approximately $500,000 from the Rose Bennett Memorial Trust to personal accounts belonging to the trustees. Grandma Rose's trust, my inheritance, the money I'd signed over for tax reasons. I sat on my kitchen floor, still holding the letter, as 10 years of casual lies crystallized into focus. Every time I asked about accessing the trust funds, Dad had given me vague explanations about market volatility and tax implications. Every time I'd struggled financially, student loans, car repairs, medical bills, Mom had sympathy but no solutions, despite supposedly managing a trust worth $500,000. Because there was no trust. Not anymore. They used my signature on those documents to legally transfer Grandma's money into their own accounts, then spent 10 years spending it while telling me it was being preserved for my future. My hands were shaking as I called the number on the IRS letterhead. I expected to reach some bureaucratic maze, but the woman who answered was Agent Sarah Chin from the Criminal Investigation Division. "I'm calling about a letter that was delivered to my address by mistake," I said, my voice barely steady. "But I think I might be a victim in this case." 3 hours later, I was sitting in Agent Chen's downtown office, a sterile room with government-issued furniture and motivational posters about tax compliance. She listened to my story with the professional calm of someone who'd heard variations of this tale many times before. "Family financial fraud is more common than people realize," she said, reviewing copies of the documents I brought. "Parents, siblings, trusted relatives, they know exactly which emotional buttons to push to maintain compliance from their victims." "But I signed the papers willingly," I said. "They didn't forge anything." "Willing signature obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation is still fraud," Agent Chen explained. "If they told you this was for tax purposes while actually planning to misappropriate the funds, that's textbook wire fraud. The fact that your family doesn't change the legal implications." She walked me through what the investigation had uncovered so far. My parents had indeed used the trust transfer documents to move Grandma's money into accounts they controlled. Over 10 years, they'd spend it on home renovations, luxury vacations, a boat, and Dad's failed attempt to start a consulting business. The paper trail is extensive, Agent Chen said, spreading bank statements across the conference table. Wire transfers to home improvement contractors, travel agencies, boat dealers. They weren't even particularly careful about hiding it. Probably because they never expected to get caught. In their minds, they legally convinced me to sign over money that they felt entitled to anyway. After all, it was Dad's mother who'd left the inheritance. In their twisted logic, they were just reclaiming what should have been theirs in the first place. What happens now? I asked. That depends on several factors. We're building a criminal case based on the tax fraud. They never reported the trust income properly, but the wire fraud charges require proving intent to defraud, which is where your testimony becomes crucial. Agent Chen explained that my signature on the documents, combined with their false representations about the purpose, could constitute wire fraud if they use electronic transfers to move the money. Given that most financial transactions over $10,000 involved wire transfers, this was almost certainly the case. Are you prepared to testify against your parents? She asked gently. The question hit me like a physical blow. 10 years of family dinners, holidays, birthday calls. 10 years of them asking about my life while hiding the fact that they'd stolen my financial security. 10 years of watching me struggle while they lived comfortably on money that should have been mine. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. The investigation moved quickly once I became a cooperating witness. Agent Chen had me review bank records, identify transactions, and provide context for various transfers. The evidence was overwhelming, a decade of systematic theft documented in meticulous detail. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed during family interactions. Agent Chen advised me to maintain normal contact while they built their case, so I continued showing up for Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, making small talk while internally screaming. Mom would complain about rising grocery prices while wearing a designer handbag I now knew cost more than my monthly rent. Dad would lecture me on financial responsibility while planning another cruise funded by my stolen inheritance. The cognitive dissonance was nauseating. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected. 3 months after my initial meeting with Agent Chen, she called to let me know they were ready to make arrests. We'll be executing search warrants and making arrests tomorrow morning, she said. I wanted to give you advance notice so you're not blindsided if they contact you. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, imagining how it would unfold. Would they be at home? Would the neighbors see? How do you arrest someone's parents for stealing their inheritance? My phone rang at 7:23 a.m. Mom's number, but Dad's voice, shaky and panicked. Natalie, we need you to come over right away. There's been some kind of misunderstanding with the government. They're saying, his voice broke. They're saying we stole money from you. Did you? I asked quietly. The silence stretched long enough that I knew the answer. It's complicated, honey. Can you just come over? We need to explain. No, Dad. It's actually very simple. You told me I was signing trust documents for tax purposes. Instead, you transferred my inheritance to yourselves and spent it. That's called fraud. More silence. Then Mom's voice in the background, crying. How does she know? How does she know? Because I'm not 19 anymore, I thought. Because I opened a letter that wasn't meant for me and discovered that my parents are thieves. The criminal trial lasted 8 months. I testified for 2 days, walking through the documents, the false representations, and the decade of lies that followed. My parents' attorney tried to paint it as a family misunderstanding and claimed they'd always intended to restore the money eventually. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Rodriguez, dismantled that argument methodically. If this was a temporary arrangement for tax purposes, why didn't they tell Ms. Bennett when they transferred the money to their personal accounts? Why didn't they provide annual statements showing the trust's performance? Why, when she asked about accessing funds for legitimate expenses, did they continue to claim the money was tied up in investments? The jury didn't buy the family misunderstanding narrative. Wire fraud, tax evasion, and breach of fiduciary duty. Dad got 3 years federal prison. Mom got 18 months and 5 years probation. But the criminal conviction was only part of the story. The civil restitution was more complex. By the time of sentencing, my parents had spent most of the original $500,000. The boat had been sold, but at a loss. The home improvements couldn't be undone. The vacation money was simply gone. However, the court ordered full restitution with interest, $500,000 plus 10 years of compound interest at the federal rate, bringing the total to nearly $750,000. Since my parents couldn't pay that immediately, their assets were seized and liquidated. The house I'd grown up in, Dad's retirement accounts, Mom's jewelry collection, everything went toward repaying what they'd stolen. It still wasn't enough to cover the full amount, so the court established a payment plan that would garnish their wages and Social Security benefits for the foreseeable future. The emotional aftermath was more complicated than the financial recovery. Dad wrote me letters from prison, rambling explanations about how the trust transfer had been meant as a temporary measure to avoid estate taxes, how they'd gotten in over their heads with expenses, how they'd always planned to make it right. Each letter contained the same hollow refrain: "We never meant to hurt you." Mom's approach was different. She oscillated between tearful apologies and bitter resentment that I'd destroyed the family by cooperating with law enforcement. According to her, I should have come to them directly instead of involving outsiders in private family business. The fact that they'd had 10 years to make things right voluntarily seemed lost on her. Extended family reactions were mixed. Dad's siblings rallied around the narrative that I'd been vindictive and ungrateful for sending my parents to prison. Mom's family was more sympathetic, particularly Aunt Linda, who'd apparently suspected something was wrong for years, but hadn't known how to address it. "Your grandmother would be heartbroken," Linda told me over coffee 6 months after the sentencing. Not about your parents going to prison, they made their choices, but about the fact that her granddaughter had to fight for 10 years to get what was rightfully hers. The money, when it finally started coming back, felt different than I'd expected. I fantasized for so long about what I'd do with my inheritance: buy a house, travel, maybe go back to school. But getting it back as court-ordered restitution came with emotional baggage that made it hard to enjoy. Every deposit into my account was a reminder of betrayal, of how naive I'd been, of how my parents had looked me in the eye for a decade while stealing from me. The money was mine, legally and morally, but it felt tainted by the process of getting it back. I used part of it for therapy, which proved more valuable than any material purchase. Dr. Martinez helped me work through the complex emotions of being financially victimized by family members. The anger was straightforward, but the guilt was more complicated. "It's common for fraud victims to blame themselves," she explained during one of our sessions, "especially when the perpetrators are family members. You feel like you should have known, should have been more suspicious, should have protected yourself better." "I was 19, I said. "I trusted my parents." "Exactly. You did what any reasonable 19-year-old would do. The failure wasn't yours, it was theirs for choosing to exploit that trust." 2 years after the trial, I used some of the restitution money to buy a small house. Nothing fancy, but mine. The first night I spent in my own home, I called Agent Chen to thank her. "Cases like yours are why I do this job," she said. "Family financial fraud is devastating because it doesn't just steal money. It steals trust, relationships, your sense of security in the world. When we can recover some of that, it matters." Dad was released after serving 2 years of his 3-year sentence. He called me once, a stilted conversation where he asked if we could move forward as a family. I told him I needed more time to process everything, which was therapist speak for probably never. Mom finished her sentence and moved to a small apartment across town. She sends birthday cards with generic messages and no return address. I don't respond, but I don't throw them away either. Dr. Martinez says I'll know when and if I'm ready to engage with that relationship again. The financial recovery took 4 years, but I eventually received most of the restitution. The final payment came with a letter from the court noting that the case was officially closed. After fees and interest calculations, I'd recovered $695,000 of the original theft. More importantly, I'd recovered something else: a sense of my own worth and agency. For 10 years, I'd been gaslit into believing that my financial struggles were normal, that the trust was being managed by people who knew better than I did. The legal process had validated what I'd always suspected deep down. I deserved better. I'm 31 now, 12 years removed from that kitchen table where I signed away my inheritance. I still work as a teacher, but now it's a choice rather than a necessity. The house is paid off, my emergency fund is solid, and I'm considering going back to school for my master's degree. Sometimes former students ask me for life advice. When they do, I always tell them the same thing: trust, but verify. Love your family, but understand that love doesn't exempt anyone from accountability. And if someone asks you to sign documents you don't understand, especially for tax reasons, get a second opinion from someone who isn't benefiting from your signature. The FBI agent was right. What my parents did was called wire fraud. But more than that, it was called theft. Not just of money, but of trust, security, and 10 years of my life spent believing lies. The money I eventually recovered was important. But the real victory was learning that I didn't have to accept being victimized just because the perpetrators were family. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones most willing to exploit that love for their own benefit. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let them. Dad was released early for bad behavior and now works as a night security guard, his wages still being garnished for restitution. Mom works part-time at a retail store and lives in a studio apartment. Neither has contacted me in over a year, and I'm okay with that. The Bennett Family Preservation Trust never existed, except on the fraudulent documents they used to steal from me. The only thing it preserved was their lifestyle at the expense of my future. Agent Chen was promoted to a supervisory role and now trains other investigators on family financial fraud cases. She told me recently that my case is used as a teaching example of how trust documents can be weaponized against naive beneficiaries. Sometimes justice looks like handcuffs and prison sentences. Sometimes it looks like a government agent asking simple questions like, "Why didn't you know where your own inheritance was being held?" The answer, as it turned out, was worth $500,000.